Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leap Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Stephen Dinan, a noted social entrepreneur and visionary political strategist, founder and CEO of the Shift Network, a leading global provider of online transformational courses and trainings. He was previously a senior staffer at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where he was the driving force behind the Shift in Action program, and at the Eastland Institute, where he directed and helped to create the Center for Theory and Research, which is a think tank for scholars, researchers, and teachers to explore human potential frontiers. A graduate of Stanford University, he also holds a master's in East-West philosophy from the California Institute of Integral Studies, member of the prestigious Transformational Leadership Council and Evolutionary Leaders Groups, and the author of Radical Spirit Spiritual Writings from the Voice of Tomorrow. Also, his most recent work, Sacred America, Sacred World, Fulfilling Our Mission and Service to All. We will be discussing that today. Also, make sure to go to leakproject.com for exclusive content, updated daily. Stephen, thanks a lot for joining us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Great. Well, I'm somebody who, I grew up in the Midwest. I moved to California. I became very committed to the path of personal growth and spiritual transformation and really exploring the leading frontiers of consciousness. But in that whole exploration, it really became clear to me that until we evolve our society, evolving our consciousness just isn't going to get us to where we need to get. It's like we need to actually apply the more enlightened principles in how we do our politics and how we make our decisions and how our vision for what America can become. America was really founded on deeply spiritual principles. It was, in the original Declaration, Thomas Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And eventually, they decided to make it a little more less spiritual by calling it self-evident. But when you look at things like creating a more perfect union or e pluribus unum, out of many one, there was a very, very conscious coding of America with higher principles that really have to do with leading us towards larger wholes, leading us towards larger unity, really leading the way ultimately towards peace building and sustainability on a global scale. And we've gotten a little stuck in that process. We've gotten into essentially a warfare psychology in our political culture, where we have two primary political parties that are really primarily focused only on gaining power and having power over the other, and pretty much doing whatever it takes in terms of that ends up fundamentally undermining our capacity to achieve really this higher mission, which is encoded in e pluribus unum, out of many one. So we're quickly kind of emerging as almost two Americas. In 1960. There was a poll that was done asking parents how concerned they would be if their child were to marry somebody of the opposite political party, and only 5% of people in 1960 said that would be a real concern for them. By 2010, that had ramped up to 50%, and we've partitioned now into almost separate, blue states versus red states, and we get our media in different places, and often it tears apart workplaces and marriages. And essentially, we've replayed the American Revolution and Civil War now in creating essentially almost a Civil War culture in our political process. And the truth is that actually the conservative value system and progressive value systems, or Republican and Democrat, are quite complementary to each other and actually very helpful, balancing to each other, because if you get all of one or the other, we tend to go off the rails of like what it's going to take for us to really evolve to the next level. So instead of a partnership dynamic where we're really seeing the different political orientations as complementary vehicles for us to grow as a country, we're at war with each other. So that's really a source of, is a key insight behind the book, Sacred America, Sacred World, that we need to treat each other as all sacred and worthy of respect. And that includes people with different political orientations, includes other religions, includes other nationalities. That's part of the wholeness and the oneness that America is ultimately designed to create. We're embracing the full global village here, and we need to do so not just within our borders, but within our political parties and ultimately within the world as a whole.
We certainly live in times where there's this divide and conquer, problem, reaction, solution. You've got either the religious card, the political card, the sexual preference card, the movie star card, everything. There's this, opposite, and it seems like if we could create a balance there where we can embrace each other's differences and at the same time find a way to work together. I think that's what's most important. Multiculturalism is great, yet when you've got different cultures that get more rights than others in a certain society, that's when you've got the division and people get upset and angry. So how do we find a way to embrace people's ideals without alienating others? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it begins with what I call political cross-training. So when you're training to be a top-tier athlete, it's often a good idea to cross-train with a different method because it'll build and develop you in different ways. So that's where you get these monstrous football players who are taking ballet classes, for instance, because they're wanting to develop their coordination in a different way than football is going to teach them. So in the same way, in politics, we can start to treat different political orientations as a form of cross-training. It's a cross-training for our mind primarily because we begin to see the world through a different lens and a different set of priorities. So if we're only taking in the viewpoints that we've inherited oftentimes or that we've developed, but then we're rehearsing that and never even taking as an interesting exploration the worldview of somebody else, we're going to be compromised by that, where our viewpoint is going to become more ossified and more stuck in different ways.
Yeah, so you're doing this cross-training essentially with the political parties. Okay.
I'll give an example, because our tendency, especially with politics, is to demonize and vilify and often express hatred towards other viewpoints than our own, partially because there's a lot of charge around decision-making and what rights we have or don't have. And so there can be a lot of understandable charge with politics. And so what we have to do as a practice, almost as a spiritual practice or a psychological practice, is to unravel our tendency to create more and more of a polarization. I'll give an example in my own life. When Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate in 2008, I just really I thought I'd done a lot of work on myself and a lot of personal growth, but I really just could not stand her. It was like nails on a chalkboard. So instead of just rehearsing that, though, after a while, I realized that it meant I had some work to do. And so I actually spent the time to read both of her books and see the world through her eyes. You know, you should see the world through growing up in Alaska, the more frontier psychology, hunting for food, the kind of down-home, G-shucks kind of language that at first I found very grating. And after really spending the time to see the world through her eyes with a couple of books, I ended up having a dream where in the dream, she and I were quite friendly with each other and in fact had a really sweet hug in the dream. So it's kind of a signal to my deeper psyche that it's like, oh, I'd come to terms with who she represented, not just as herself, but as a part of the American population that really has it deserves its own respect and that needs to be honored. And, you know, I ended up writing a column about this at Huffington Post called Dissolving the Palin Prejudice. And I got a ton of fan mail from conservatives. And what it did is it kind of helped to open the door to a different kind of relationship with conservatives. I still consider myself a progressive, and I do vote and contribute in alignment with that. But I also find that oftentimes listening to conservative critiques is very helpful in understanding why, how change can happen. Understanding, for instance, how conservatives view certain progressive changes as an assault on their sovereignty in different ways. And so what I think that it's allowed me to do over time is to start to create more of a deep sense of respect and learning from conservatives, especially because it's like each value system has its own kind of training. And there's a sort of a toughness and a rigor and a self-discipline and a personal responsibility that conservatives tend to prioritize more than progressives. And I've actually learned from that and grown from that. My father-in-law was a very strongly conservative man, and he was pretty tough on me at first, but we eventually created a friendship and then a sense of mutual respect. He became a great mentor to me in business. So I learned from some of that toughness. He challenged me to survive mixed martial arts and street fighting as a training for business. And that actually was good advice and a good challenge for me to cultivate a different side of myself than I had been, to some of that more martial discipline, if you will. So I think that if we can step back and say, first of all, that in a truly sacred world, in a sacred America, we are honoring and respecting everyone's right to exist and right to have their opinions. And our democracy is really built on a foundation of mutual respect for difference. And part of that taking to the next level is to say, you know what, I'm actually gonna step over the line and learn from you, and then learn from how you see the world, and actually be able to understand how we can design a better America from different value systems. And sometimes I'll give an example like how this can be really practical is the $15 an hour minimum wage has become a real sort of torch on the left for this is about a more enlightened society and uplifting the poor and reducing corporate exploitation. However, all the arguments for it are essentially left-leaning arguments. But if you take a more of a right-leaning perspective and say, you know what, the $15 an hour minimum wage isn't just about uplifting the poor, it's about reducing the size of government. Because when you have companies only paying somebody $7 an hour and they can't actually live on that they need food subsidies, they need rent subsidies, they need childcare subsidies. What you're effectively doing is increasing the size of government and all the bureaucracy involved with serving that. You're actually increasing the tax burden and you're reducing people's individual sense of responsibility. So you can make the argument that advocating for $15 an hour minimum wage actually is about reducing the size of government, allowing people to be more self-responsible, reducing the amount of subsidizing of specific companies as well, since ultimately the $7 paying somebody less than it takes to survive actually is effectively asking taxpayers to subsidize companies. So we don't want that. We want to minimize the size of government. So you can basically frame the whole argument from within right-leaning value systems, and you can end up making more of a bridge and more of an understanding, have a more interesting dialogue than the sort of class warfare dialogue, which tends to happen more from the left, as it's all about the 99% versus the 100%. I really make the case in my book that we need to occupy the 100%, not the 99%, because ultimately, whatever sort of division that we're stuck with and perpetuating is going to create kind of a freezing up of our potential, because we need the wealth of the 1%. We need the innovation and the business sense in order to grow the next country. And if they're essentially the 1% are feeling like they're under siege and being demonized, they're far less likely to actually work together with the 99% to create a better America.
And being that we live in this dualistic society, when you look at the Democrats and the Republicans on paper, you can say, well, the Republicans are more conservative. They typically have more beliefs in gun rights, gun ownership. They're not as acceptable towards abortion typically and other things. So other than that, though, I mean, what are the differences really between a Democrat and a Republican? If you look at who's in office now in the administration and how many, we're in this perpetual war state, yet wasn't the administration that was brought into power almost 8 years ago, weren't they supposed to make change, and we're all supposed to be happy, end war, get out of Iraq? And it seems like it's been these perpetual proxy wars ever since 2001.
Yeah, well, I'm not as much of the school that there's no difference between the two parties. What I'm interested in is understanding it from a deeper level. Like, first of all, why have we constellated into this binary system? And I think George Lakoff's analysis that the Republican Party is more sourced from what he calls the strict father archetype, and that the Democratic Party is more sourced from the nurturing mother archetype. So there's a predilection, I would say, towards a more masculine pattern of being and more masculine decision making, and more focus on the protector versus the nurturer. The protector wants more defense, wants more rule, more respect for the rule of law. The nurturer wants to extend more benefits to other people, to take care of the downtrodden in many ways. And so you end up with something of a nice way to see that Republican and Democratic parties in some ways kind of embody the father and mother of America, and that we need mom and dad to get along and not to just be at war with each other, to recognize there's a complementarity there. There's a strength and a discipline and a self-responsibility on the right that is very valuable and for us to cultivate. And there's a generosity and a love and a caretaking impulse on the left that's very important for us to integrate as well. Now, that shouldn't, if the two primary parties can be in better relationship with each other, and that not just on the national level, but really on a personal level, it hopefully also creates more space for a diversity of political perspectives that can help to juice the engine of evolution more. I mean, we've seen Bernie Sanders this year coming in with more of a kind of a neo-democratic socialist vision, which has been outside of the mainstream, but actually now we're realizing there's a far more people who believe in many of those principles. And same with the Green Party. We're also seeing the resurgence of the Libertarian Party, which has another set of philosophies. So this diversity of political orientations can be very helpful and growthful for our country to embrace, as long as the primary polarity, the sort of the Republican Democrat, slightly more masculine, slightly more feminine kind of way of dealing with our national laws are more in balance and harmony with each other, then we have a more of a diversity of opinions about what we need to do. And so part of my theory around what you mentioned, the perpetual war state, is that we have had a political culture that has been built too much around the sort of like a hyper masculine and more violent culture, which is where we need to bring in more feminine force, if you will, into the political process, which can be through more women political leaders, which is great and I support, but it can also be through men being more open to a different kind of dynamic, a more collaborative dynamic as well. And it's not that one is right or wrong, but it's more like the balance between them is really important, so that we have the culture of politics be balanced in a masculine and feminine way. And then that makes it less of a martial, oppositional, war kind of torn culture. And it makes us less likely to be engaging in unnecessary aggression overseas as well. Because as America comes into balance with more feminine and in balance and harmony and respect with the masculine, then we end up with, I think, really being able to better fulfill our unifying mission for the planet, rather than being perceived as sort of essentially a very aggressive, more militaristic empire, which ultimately is going to get very expensive for us and undermine trust around the world and result in a diminishment of our overall standing in the world. So, you can only, when we're 5% of the world's population and spending, half of the world's expenditure on military, that has to hurt us eventually, because the world will eventually exceed us economically, and then if we're spending so much of our time and energy on military, then we're ultimately going to undermine our strength. So we need to kind of have a balance between the military expenditures and the investments in what allows us to really go to the next level.
And I'm reading through Sacred America. If you could talk to us more about what you actually mean by Sacred America. And I just want to say one thing real quick. When you look at these giant conglomerates and corporations, they seem to profit off of sweet poisons. You look at companies that put in aspartame, genetically modified crops into the food supply and the cereals. I saw somebody take a box of cereal once, put it in a blender with a little bit of water, and essentially he was able to pull up about a quarter-sized amount of iron that literally stuck to a magnet from breaking down cereal. I mean, this stuff's just nasty out there, and it seems like, it's terrible. I could go on for 10 episodes about the food stuff, but basically, make a long story short, you look at what goes on at the top levels, and you can go buy a soda pop with 30 chemicals in it that's half the price of a soda that's got 4 chemicals in it. It's like, how does that work, And how do we get to a society that is more prone towards keeping balance and making profit off of helping others, creating food that is good for you, wholesome, not coming in from China next to toxic waste dumps where they drop a bunch of plastic off and burn it next to it. I'm just using that as an idea, because obviously I think the Sacred America is probably more of a balanced approach where people become healthier, not profiting off of dark ecstasy, essentially.
Essentially, yeah. I think that, one of the things that's sort of absolutely essential is for us to create the framework for capitalism to succeed, because it is a great engine for innovation and newness. I mean, so we want capitalism to reach its highest level, and what I call enlightened business is, we've done a whole summit on enlightened business. So capitalism can be a great engine for the good, but basically if you don't have the right incentive structures, it can lead to more and more exploitation. So you have to set the framework well, meaning that we prevent some of the abuses that can happen, like child labor. We got rid of that. We got rid of slavery. We got rid of child labor. And now we have our own versions of that, which is part of what you're pointing to, is if you can produce products that really are filled with crap that aren't good for people, but market it well and sell a lot of it, and it's cheaper than doing it with quality ingredients. Right now, companies are incentivized to do that. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that we need to essentially create more transparency. So the more we can create transparency about the actual social, environmental, and citizen impacts of a company, the more at the point of sale, the more we're going to incentivize companies to go in the right direction. So one idea that I have in the book is called the conscious ratings tag. Same way we have nutritional labels now, you can have companies be rated on a range of different metrics for how conscious they are being as a company. So that includes how they're treating their workers, it includes how their impact on the environment, it includes the sort of the supply chain, it includes where they invest their money. So you can basically have like broken out by category different ratings that are by an objective body, neutral third party that is rating companies, and then you get a tag. It says here, this has got it's like an 8 out of 10 on this score, a 7 out of 10 on this score, and the aggregate score of like a 7.5 out of 10. So you could make your decisions about at the point of sales. Like I'm only going to do business with companies that have an 8 out of 10 or better, and that's going to help to make more of a price signal to the companies that they want to compete on how conscious they are. Now we have various elements of this already in place. We've got Energy Star for appliances. We've got organic food ratings for food, but to actually make it truly competitive, where companies are getting ahead by raising their score over time, you need to have something that's more granular and that sort of is sort of industry wide. So the advantage of doing something like this you could also do screens that are the next level beyond the socially responsible investment screen. So you're only investing your money in companies that have a certain rating as well. So the point of this isn't necessarily to just try to control the companies and shut down. It basically makes the whole thing transparent. So you really know when you buy something what the deeper ramifications of that purchase are. And my belief is that the more transparent we can make the actual impact of our purchasing, the more companies are going to be flooding to be seen as best in class. And the internet really helps this because we have access to so much more information now than we ever did, and so there's so much more propagation. So if we can just set the frameworks, and we have certain minimums, we don't want child labor. I think that we should set a minimum wage that's much higher, more like a $15 an hour minimum wage. And that allows companies that really compete more effectively within the frameworks of the sort of a conscious framework, then those are be the ones that make the most money and get the most business and grow the fastest and get the biggest market share. And so, we already have some of those forces in motion, but I think we can take it to the next level, and it helps to fulfill the promise of capitalism rather than the problems of capitalism that we see right now.
Well, indeed. And I like that system that you're talking about as far as the number system goes, yet when you've got people out there maybe that are struggling financially and they see that one business has a number of 5 because their practices aren't that great, and there's another one that has a level of 9, but they're a lot more money, I'm just trying to think of a way to balance that out as well.
Yeah, well, I think there's certain standards that you just don't allow. So it's like, okay, you don't allow companies to just spew toxic waste into the local river because, that's one way to price. It's like you basically prevent certain things through regulation. There's other things you price in, more like we can do with carbon output into the atmosphere. It's like we can price in with carbon fees that there's an impact of burning excess fossil fuels and emitting that in the environment. That has an impact on the greater good. So we need to price that into the system so that companies are incentivized to continue to reduce their negative impact on the larger whole. So there's regulation, there's pricing things in, and then there's competition to get to be the best in the field. So you're having the least environmental impact, the most social benefit, and you're generating products that people love, that those are the companies that are really going to soar. So that's part of what I mean. You have to kind of align all the different incentives to make sure that capitalism fulfills its promise. It's not like there's just one, it's not a single bullet approach. You can't just say, oh, we're going to do just one or the other, because if it's all about just regulation and containment, it's like there's ways to slip around the edges on things. And if companies can still do bad stuff, then it's going to ultimately harm our collective. So, in a lot of these things, it takes a bit of the right-leaning perspectives, a bit of the left-leaning perspectives to design a system that really works. And part of where we're frozen up right now, we're spending all of our time on partisan warfare. When one party's in power, it essentially freezes up and shuts down the other, so they can't really get anything done. And then you've got the corrupting influence of a lot of money in politics. So I think we need to have a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and then to basically then be in a position to improve on a lot of these other fronts and work in a more bipartisan fashion on some of the deeper reforms. So that's what I believe is necessary.
Absolutely. And I'd recommend our listeners go to theshiftnetwork.com if you'd like to know more about this opportunity. And one of the things that I'm thinking of is if you can create a new system that works on values and morals better instead of just the bottom line, do you stop with America? I mean, what is the overall vision of what you see? Is this a global government? Is this country governments that have a connection to a global one as well?
Yeah, now I know this. In a lot of left-oriented, on both sides, there's suspicion of centralized power. I would say is key. Because part of what we've seen is that we've had a lot of centralized power with the United States. Sometimes that leads to an increase in corruption and a decrease in taking people's real needs into account. So some people want to. There's a very legitimate role to bring more power locally However, I think what we need to do is two things. We need to bring more power locally, and we also need to have better and more effective systems of global governance as well. And I use governance in a light touch way. It's not about one world government, which is kind of oppressive, authoritarian thing, but it's about having some level of elected representation to decide on truly global challenges rather than states duking it out. Whoever's got the biggest military wins, and people are going to say, no, we're not going to do that or that. We have some truly global challenges now, including most of the environmental challenges. And those do require global accords. They require some level of global coordination, and that when you have global challenges, you need to have global representation to deal with that. So I think that eventually we will create something like a global democratic Congress that is basically working on and deciding, making decisions on that 5 or 10% of problems that are truly global, while we also have more power moved to the local. So right now we're kind of stuck at the nation state level where there's a lot of power aggregated at the level of nations, and there's not as much power locally sometimes. So we kind of need to pull some of that power locally, pull a little bit of that power to more global coordination. And it needs to be very democratic as well. Right now, we don't have any representation directly. We don't elect anyone to represent us at a global level. We basically elect people at a national level, and then the nation states kind of figure things out. But that system it's a bit unwieldy to have a couple hundred nations that are all working through the United Nations. And so, I'm in favor of eventually moving towards sort of a limited form of planetary democracy. And so that's part of where I see things going. It's on a long time horizon. It's probably on the time horizon of several decades, but I think it's important to see that notion that we can have a kind of a healthy form of planetary coordination and democratic representation rather than simply this kind of like more Orwellian kind of big brother kind of thing.
It's like 1984 meets Tron meets Twilight Zone with the technologies that they have now. It's absolutely fascinating. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is that quote that Gary Strand made, a democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Do you... So let's talk about that for a minute if we can, just because I certainly feel that we all have an opinion and a right to make our options known. So that's wonderful. Yet, how do you get around something like that? That's, if you got 50 million people versus 49,999 people, and one other person says, well, I think that this vote should be, we get to take everybody's home and make it this 50%, and that 49% has to jump off a cliff, because democracy says so. I mean, people are strange, people vote sometimes out of emotional, and they don't really put enough thought into stuff based on ignorance oftentimes. I mean, I do that. So how do you get around that,
That's where I think that representative democracy tends to be stronger than straight democracy on most things. There are certain things that I think it is important to give people a direct vote in. But because, when you have essentially professional representation that can think deeper and longer and more systematically about something, they're generally going to make better decisions than somebody who's like kind of having on a whim making a decision. They've done 10 minutes of research. We're asked all the time in different citizen initiatives to make decisions about very complex things without really being able to spend much time on it. So I think that overall, if you can get rid of the corruption factor of money in politics and the lobbying force, and there's a lot of different reforms that are necessary to do that, to essentially have the wisest, most selfless, most public interested people who are thoughtful be elected into positions where they're really thinking deeply about what are the best policies, what are the best structures, what are the best frameworks. Those people are generally going to be making better decisions than a kind of a straight up democratic vote, and also putting in place certain protections. Like the United States, we definitely, slavery would not have been outlawed with a straight democratic vote. There's certain societal advances that are required to happen more from a minority first. We probably would not have had gay marriage legalized when we did if it was just left up to the public, which was largely opposed to different gay rights for a long time. And so there's a democratic component that's necessary, but sometimes there has to be a championing of rights and a protection of minorities, minority populations from a tyranny of the majority as well. And so, I think that we have to be realistic about that. That representative democracy is generally going to be better so long as we can prevent some of the corrupting influences. And on certain really key issues, I think it is appropriate to get a litmus test on the larger public. Now, one way you can actually create a balance of the two, which I think would be very interesting to consider as we move into a more planetary era, is we're getting close to the time when we have 100% of people have internet access through smartphones. It's probably, by 2020 or so, we're going to be in the 80 to 90% range globally. So what you can have is a system where you could actually require companies that have telecommunications devices to have a voting app installed, and you could take a finger, like get a finger on the pulse of what all of your constituencies are thinking. So let's say you've got 10 million people in your state, you're a senator, then you could basically say, here's a really crucial vote, we want to get input from our constituency on this, and it's going to show up as like, share your opinion today. So you can take a kind of instant poll of your entire constituency. So when I talk about a form of limited global democracy, we could design in something like that is actually built on direct participation. So you could basically say right in real time, hey, this is how I stand on this. Doesn't necessarily mean it's binding, but it does mean that representatives could more easily and quickly represent the actual positions of their constituencies, while protecting against some of the, as you said, we don't want to embed racism and certain things that may still be common enough that people might, for instance, in the United States right now, I think we're in real danger of persecuting Muslim minorities. And that is something that needs to be protected against.
Well, it seems like they're kind of, when I say they, I'm referring to whoever it is that controls the politicians and the lobbyists and the defense contractors, because all over the media you have this onslaught of news that talks about how illegal immigrants are coming across the borders, and they're by just tens of thousands. And I know that that's how America was founded, upon illegal immigrants. So don't get me wrong. I think that everybody should have a right to come here. But they try and spin this fear factor with the masses, saying, well, a lot of them haven't been vetted, and they're in military shape. They could be black ops with these other governments coming in here to infiltrate. And then things like Orlando happen. And I feel that there's a lot of black ops stuff involved with not only the media, but these big gun catastrophes that happen, whether or not they're false flags or staged events or prepared or it's totally legit. I don't see how one person could take out 49 people, shoot 50 more multiple times, no matter what kind of gun you have, unless you're Rambo walking in there with an M60 and a strap of bullets around your body. I think there was probably a lot more to it than that. And these things happen during political events. And oftentimes, well, now we can wag the dog over here. We can use these keys to say, well, let's go after people's guns or rights or whatever the case is. I mean, we could be talking about something completely different. So do you think that the media is really a big part of this divide and conquer, yin yang, opposites, etc., and that is going to have to be changed at the top levels in order to create this society of harmony?
I don't feel as much concern about general media now, partially because the media has become so fragmented, and there are so many outlets for, basically any one of us can become our own media, in the sense that we can publish our opinions and aggregate that and gain momentum. And we have so many more diversity of things that we can tune into than once was true. Now, I do think that the top level media has certain forces that keep it within an accepted discourse. I was just reading, for instance, this last weekend about a whole new lawsuit that's been brought against Trump by somebody who's accusing him of raping her when she was 13 years old. Is connected to the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing. For the most part, the major media have all not aired that story. They've not brought it forward, even though there was this article about it. Huffington Post had 47,000 shares, and it was quite credibly written. And so you have a major potential story that wasn't broken. And, so the question is, why is that not breaking? Is that kind of going outside of the bounds of what's acceptable? And so I think that there's certain boundaries that are set about the kind of acceptable discourse, some of which may be helpful, some of which may be preventing like even deeper stories from breaking, like you're pointing to. I don't think of it as a sort of an organized conspiracy of silence. It's more about, I think that media companies have forces upon them. There's market forces saying, it's like, what do people actually want to read? What are they reading? So that there's a survivalist kind of mentality of like, okay, we gotta put out the stories that people are going to be palatable. There's also some level of not wanting to minimize access. So if you break a story that turns out to be false or that is too outside the paradigm, it might diminish your access to other folks. So I don't necessarily see it as sort of an organized conspiracy to silence certain viewpoints, so much as there's market forces involved, there's social forces involved, what people are kind of quote permitted or acceptable to look at. And the truth is that, any one of us who really wants to dig into a particular area, it's like, wasn't like the story was shut down completely around this 13-year-old with Trump. I was still able to read quite a bit online about it and really sort of ponder, is this something that is going to break in a bigger way? So I don't know, with the internet, I think that there's a tendency to blame kind of larger media rather than own our power. And the truth is, we do each have a tremendous amount of power now, through all the different social outlets, through building our own base. I mean, you've obviously built up your own base and followership with this as well. So I think it's more about owning our power rather than just simply critiquing the existing power structures, and realizing that there has been a great democratization of the capacity of media has been democratized, and that is really freeing us to look at just about anything we want to look at.
Right on. That was a real powerful statement. Let's own our power. Let's quit blaming other people for what we can't read, and let's find the story ourselves. Let's jump into some of the most significant shadow issues that America hasn't faced.
Okay. Well, I think that, I really feel like it's important that we go deep to the roots. And, I think the ultimate roots of America's problematic aspects all kind of come back around to really a certain level of kind of destruction, like a destructiveness that was built into who we were. And so this country was founded. It was built on a genocide, and that's something that we really need to face as a country. Germany has matured as a country because it had to come to terms with its Holocaust and the real shadow side of power and the impulse to systematically destroy another people. Now, America doesn't think of ourselves that way, but we really have an equally sized and equally destructive genocide that we haven't looked at. And with the indigenous peoples, when settlers first arrived on the shores of America, there were over, some people say 18 million, some people say 14 million, but at least in that 14 to 18 million range of inhabitants of our country, of indigenous peoples, through, I think, 90 plus nations. There was a lot of nations and a lot of, complexity to that whole thing. And within 100 years, there was only 1 million left. And that was through systematic slaughter. It was through introduction of diseases. It was through absolute warfare. It was very planned, and it was very executed by a lot of folks. And so it's a horror history to have to come to terms with. And the reason I think it's important is because what could have happened with the native peoples is that we could have had more of a merging of wisdom streams. There were certain streams of wisdom, the kind of Enlightenment thinking and progressive political values, and even some of the more esoteric streams with the founding fathers were carrying from Masons and other things. There were things that were really carried that were important in the settler culture, but there was also the values of the native peoples that were much more attuned to the value of the land and animals and people, and so there was a deeper respect for the health of the tribe and the full participation. The Iroquois had a really lovely system of balancing the male councils with the female councils that kind of created a check and balance on some of the martial tendencies of the men. There are ways that, if you look from the Hopi to the Lakota, that there were wisdom streams that we lost access to, at least as a culture, because we engaged in this deeper genocide. So I think it's really important that we do this shadow work, because it's humbling to us, and it focuses us less on pointing the finger at elsewhere and realizing, wow, we have one of the worst genocides in history that we have perpetrated, and we still see the downstream impacts of that in some of the poorest counties in the country are on Native American reservations. And there's a real unhealed, festering wound there. So we've done a lot of things with the Shift Network to build bridges to different indigenous leaders. We've done a Global Indigenous Wisdom Summit. We've done some fundraisers. We've done things that help to create a declaration of commitment to indigenous peoples. They're all, we haven't shifted the whole thing by any means, but we've been taking positive steps. And I think that as a country, we can do a lot more and integrate more of the grounded wisdom of indigenous peoples into how we think of ourselves as a country. So, ultimately, America's designed as a melting pot of different cultures and different consciousness streams. And so for creating something that's more whole and more balanced, it requires us to integrate the indigenous wisdom streams and peoples in a deeper way. And I would maintain the same is true of our history of slavery, which we're still really seeing play out in a larger scale with different Black Lives Matter and the criminal justice system. There's a lot of reflections of essentially our unhealed history with slavery is not complete. Even with Obama as a president, it hasn't shifted our fundamental culture on a deep level, that there's a way in which we still are dealing with the legacy residue of slavery. So those are two areas that, as sort of deep shadow work as a country, that bring us into more humility, make us a bit less arrogant, more able to see the shadow side of the way we wield power, and ultimately make us more whole when we can integrate the wisdom and blessing and beauty of these of other cultures in a deeper way than we have.
And with all of the power that's in these political leaders and the people that put them in power, essentially, how do you get them to become more balanced and equal and not so narcissistic and all about themselves? Because that's really, get to the people that have this kind of power, I feel would be a good boost or jumpstart to this movement, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that, a lot of times it boils down to human connections and building human relationships. The whole gay rights movement really took off when mainly through people coming out. So it's like there's a pretty direct correlation between people's respect and support of gay rights with knowing somebody who was gay. And so the more people that came out, the more people like, wow, I know Bob and he's actually a great guy. And so I feel more supportive now of gay rights because I know Bob. And, so even though it was painful and sometimes dangerous for people to come out, ultimately it came down to that. And so same thing with a lot of policy level things. The whole transpartisan movement that I'm a part of is about building bridges across divides. So I'm going personally to Cleveland in 2 weeks to be part of the Democratic or Republican National Convention. I don't have access to the actual convention, but I want to be there. And part of my goal is not to make protests. It's to build allies and friends. I don't have as many friends who are high-level Republican leaders, and I would like to build that, not because I want to become a Republican, but because I feel like that level of personal connection is part of what softens divides and allows for collaborations. I've talked with one leader who was the founder of the Log Cabin Republicans about doing events together around Sacred America, Sacred World. And then I'm going to go to Philadelphia and be part of things in Philadelphia. And then we're doing a big American Citizen Summit online. So the more we can actually think about how can we build a bridge. So I did that with Sarah Palin. I was mentioning, writing the Huffington Post article. I don't have a personal connection with her yet, but I'd be happy to have a personal connection with her because it really takes that human touch to begin to soften opinions, and that's where this polarization and protest kind of energy can really work at loggerheads. Because when people feel like they're hated or misunderstood, or they tend to pull their tentacles in, and they don't want to work together with folks. So that's where the Occupy the 99% movement might have been a kind of a feel good in many different ways to sort of rise up and take a stand on this, but it probably didn't shift too many people in the 1% into being allies. There's a tendency to kind of like sequester off more. So I'm more interested in building bridges across divides, and the reason is that it's like you can speak into somebody's deeper listening, because the vast majority of people really want to be good people, and they may be stuck in systems that are very difficult to change, and they actually need our help, whether that's the government or large corporations. If we can be allies to them and to find the place where they do want to make change, they do want to leave a legacy, they do want to have an impact, that's ultimately going to be better than just shouting them down and demonizing them in different ways. So you look at some of the people like Mark Zuckerberg has pledged 99% of his wealth to major philanthropic endeavors, or Bill Gates. That's what we need. We need the 99%, or we need the 1% getting really serious about change, and it doesn't happen as much through stick as it does through building human connections and creating new opportunities. So it's like, can we embrace somebody who's in the wealthy class, and through that personal connection point and a sense of to call them into their higher service and their higher destiny, because it actually makes people feel better. Nobody really likes to be vilified and outcast. It's more like, they've got an important piece of the equation. They happen to control a lot of the wealth and the money in our country, and we need that to really fulfill our purpose. So to more woo them rather than try to like overthrow them, I think is ultimately the task.
Right. And for those that have an opportunity to listen to this broadcast, I'd strongly recommend going to sacredamerica.net if you'd like to pick up your copy of Sacred America, Sacred World, as well as StephenDinan.com. Now, we talked earlier about the Constitution for a minute, and you said you think that there could be an amendment there. What is your thought of the Constitution?
I think that I like what Thomas Jefferson said, is that, it's basically that human society has to evolve with the changing times, and that he thought originally that it might be a good idea to have a new constitution every 30 years with each new generation, because the challenge is any big system is how to optimize it to preserve what's been good and to allow growth to go to the next level. So big companies have this problem all the time, is that they start to become ossified and stuck in ruts, and they've been doing things one way for another, and then they get knocked off by the young upstart companies that are like more innovative, more nimble, and actually change with the market conditions. So anytime you got a big structure, you gotta have you gotta have forces that really preserve the best of what's worked, and then other things that like get rid of the old. So Cenk Uygur, who has been leading Wolfpack, which is focused on the constitutional amendment to get the money out of politics, says, every generation pretty much since our founding has gotten one constitutional amendment passed, and this needs to be ours. So I think that if we say that we have to hold this tension between truly honoring the genius. There's a great genius that was embedded in the Constitution, a great design in many ways. And it was 230, or what was it, about 230 years ago at this point, that was done, maybe 235. And it was, there was no internet. There was, our world is so vastly different now that you basically have to keep evolving the structure. And I think of it more like source code for a computer. It's like you don't ever get rid of the original source code that you build an operating system on, but you keep building upon it. You keep refining it, you keep going to the next level. So I think that we have to view America as an evolving experiment, that the source code needs to be honored, but not become the limitation on our further growth as well, since we have to say, you know what, it's not working in this arena. The whole thing with the level of lobbyists and influence of money and media, all those forces weren't even in existence at the founding. So we have to have new protections to protect the core of our democracy from some of these corrupting influences. So we always have to say, what needs to be addressed now? And one of those is money in politics. And there are also structural things that happen over time. I think that eventually we'll need to correct what's happened with the Federal Reserve, and that the money creation powers being privately held versus in the public interest. I think that that's ultimately undermines the health of our democracy. So, there's a lot of things that do get. It's like a computer operating system. You get bugs in the code, you get breakdowns, you get things that aren't working as well, and you say, okay, well, it's time to go to the next level. And that's why I use that metaphor in Sacred America's Sacred World, that we need to go to an America 7.0. And I think we've had at least 6 or 7 major upgrades to the operating system of our country, all of which still have to build upon and respect the coding of the founding. And the Constitution was really designed with vehicles to grow and expand, and it was designed as an evolving operating system, not as something that we're just going to sit around and worship to the end of time, but to say, you know what, we've got new times, we've got new challenges, we've got to keep innovating on top of what we've been given.
Absolutely. And you make up some really good points. I like some of the stuff you're talking about and the references of the operating system. I did hear you talk before about how you felt like we are in the 7th level of evolution, like we've gone through 6 stages before. So I can definitely see some connections there. And I'm also wondering, let's say that this year Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, and do you think there would be a big difference if she makes it in office versus Trump? Or do you think that either way, the world's still going to turn a certain way, and the outcome of America will be pretty much the same?
No, I believe there will be a very large difference between a Hillary presidency and a Trump presidency for a variety of reasons. But I think that in many ways, I don't want to be in the mode of vilifying Trump. There's a lot of things that I can admire about him, but I do feel that he's in many ways an embodiment of what we're outgrowing rather than what we're moving into. And I think that we need to honor that. We need to honor the strong masculine, the kind of the business empire builder, and the person who's the truth teller and kind of a tough guy. But I think that ultimately we live in a different world now than Trump can really demonstrate mastery of on a political level. We live in a more interconnected, globalized world that requires not an autocratic decision-making style, but someone who's really taking into a lot of different lines of feedback and intelligence in, who knows how to kind of work those levers of power in a more nuanced way. And I think that Hillary Clinton has really developed those skills over time as in her various roles. And so she's going to have a greater sophistication for how to understand how to work the levers of power of Washington as it exists than somebody who's basically been an autocratic business guy who's built around his own business, his own branding. So I do think that there would be huge differentials. And I do think that Trump would be far more likely to get us into some global wars than Hillary as well. So that said, I do think that it's important to champion what we want to see without making the other person evil or wrong. I'm not a Trump hater. I don't feel like, I don't want to denigrate his followers. In fact, I feel like they need to be respected and honored as well, because they've got a vision for the future that they want to create, and they feel that Trump is going to be the biggest champion of that. So, I feel like we have to listen to and respect the people who are supporting him, and also make our own discernment that ultimately I think that he's going to take us backwards rather than forwards.
And if you look at the Benghazi scandal that's really been plaguing Hillary and her campaign, what is your thoughts on that, just real quick? And do you feel that will affect her outcome of becoming president?
It seems like she's navigated the Benghazi thing pretty fully now. I thought the testimony to Congress, she showed a lot of mastery. I personally think that that's more of a part of the political football kind of metaphor of just trying to take her down a notch. I think that the email server scandal is got more problematic elements, and in the larger scheme of things, what we really need is somebody who really knows understands how the world works, knows global leaders, understands government in a deep way. And I think she's certainly made mistakes, and there's mistakes she's publicly owned. And I think that that's true of anybody who is in a position of power. You are going to make mistakes. It's a matter of how egregious they are, how much do they compromise your future ability. I don't see either Benghazi or the email thing compromising her future ability to be a good president. So that's where I stand on those things. I feel that ultimately they are, there are ways that she could have navigated those things better, and I think she recognizes certain aspects of that. And I think that there's a kind of a move on quality. I think there are things that are like deal breakers, and I don't see either of those as deal breakers.
Okay, and I appreciate you letting me put you on the spot right there. I would also recommend our listeners go to theshiftnetwork.com, because you've got your blog up there, events, courses, videos, and you're on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Pinterest, and other avenues. What would you like to close out tonight with, Stephen, that you feel would be important for our audience?
What I want to say in closing is it's very easy to get caught up in the critiques of where we are as a country. I just want to encourage all of you to really remember what it is that has touched you and moved you most deeply about America. It could be the beauty of our natural landscape, the principles that were founded, the times that we've really been of greatest service to the world. And keep that flame alight in your heart, because to really evolve something to the next level, we always have to love it. So we have to love America even while challenging her to grow further. So to hold this kind of place in your heart where you're really deeply honoring and respecting who we've been, what we've created, while also being clear-eyed and sober about the ways we've fallen short, so that we can actually activate a vision, a potential, and work together with everybody, not just the people that think like us politically, but work together with everybody to evolve a more perfect union, a greater nation, and really a light unto the world. And I think that's really why we've all chosen to incarnate in this country, that there is a very high purpose for America. And yes, there are ways that we are falling short, but we can overcome those. But it takes all of us saying yes, rolling up our sleeves, working together, and not just, essentially squandering our creative energy in a lot of bickering and infighting.
Right on. Well, it's been really great to speak with you, Stephen. You certainly bring a lot of really good approaches to the table, and a few things that you said had some pretty powerful impacts on me. So greatly appreciated. You're doing a really good job, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk again sometime.
Great. Thanks so much, Rex.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too. And also, folks, make sure to go to leakproject.com. If you subscribe and become an exclusive member at Leak Project, you'll have access to all sorts of exclusive content only available for members. You can go to youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. You'll get access to the latest podcasts on there as well. Be safe, folks. Be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Good night. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Stephen Dinan, a noted social entrepreneur and visionary political strategist, founder and CEO of the Shift Network, a leading global provider of online transformational courses and trainings. He was previously a senior staffer at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, where he was the driving force behind the Shift in Action program, and at the Eastland Institute, where he directed and helped to create the Center for Theory and Research, which is a think tank for scholars, researchers, and teachers to explore human potential frontiers. A graduate of Stanford University, he also holds a master's in East-West philosophy from the California Institute of Integral Studies, member of the prestigious Transformational Leadership Council and Evolutionary Leaders Groups, and the author of Radical Spirit spiritual writings from the Voice of Tomorrow. Also, his most recent work, Sacred America, Sacred World, Fulfilling Our Mission in Service to All. We will be discussing that today. Also, make sure to go to leakproject.com for exclusive content, updated daily. Stephen, thanks a lot for joining us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Great. Well, I'm somebody who, I grew up in the Midwest. I moved to California. I became very committed to the path of personal growth and spiritual transformation and really exploring the leading frontiers of consciousness. But in that whole exploration, it really became clear to me that until we evolve our society, evolving our consciousness just isn't going to get us to where we need to get. It's like we need to actually apply the more enlightened principles in how we do our politics and how we make our decisions and how our vision for what America can become. America was really founded on deeply spiritual principles. It was, in the original Declaration, Thomas Jefferson had written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And eventually, they decided to make it a little more less spiritual by calling it self-evident. But when you look at things like creating a more perfect union or e pluribus unum, out of many one, there was a very, very conscious coding of America with higher principles that really have to do with leading us towards larger wholes, leading us towards larger unity, really leading the way ultimately towards peace building and sustainability on a global scale. And we've gotten a little stuck in that process. We've gotten into essentially a warfare psychology in our political culture, where we have two primary political parties that are really primarily focused only on gaining power and having power over the other, and pretty much doing whatever it takes in terms of that ends up fundamentally undermining our capacity to achieve really this higher mission, which is encoded in e pluribus unum, out of many one. So we're quickly kind of emerging as almost two Americas. In 1960. There was a poll that was done asking parents how concerned they would be if their child were to marry somebody of the opposite political party, and only 5% of people in 1960 said that would be a real concern for them. By 2010, that had ramped up to 50%, and we've partitioned now into almost separate, separate blue states versus red states, and we get our media in different places, and often it tears apart workplaces and marriages. And essentially, we've replayed the American Revolution and Civil War now in creating essentially almost a Civil War culture in our political process. And the truth is that actually the conservative value system and progressive value systems, or Republican and Democrat, are quite complementary to each other and actually very helpful, balancing to each other, because if you get all of one or the other, we tend to go off the rails of like what it's going to take for us to really evolve to the next level. So instead of a partnership dynamic where we're really seeing the different political orientations as complementary vehicles for us to grow as a country, we're at war with each other. So that's really the source of, it's a key insight behind the book, Sacred America, Sacred World, that we need to treat each other as all sacred and worthy of respect. And that includes people with different political orientations, includes other religions, includes other nationalities. That's part of the wholeness and the oneness that America is ultimately designed to create. We're embracing the full global village here, and we need to do so not just within our borders, but within our political parties and ultimately within the world as a whole.
We certainly live in times where there's this divide and conquer, problem, reaction, solution. You've got either the religious card, the political card, the sexual preference card, the movie star card, everything. There's this, opposite, and it seems like if we could create a balance there where we can embrace each other's differences and at the same time find a way to work together. I think that's what's most important. Multiculturalism is great, yet when you've got different cultures that get more rights than others in a certain society, that's when you've got the division and people get upset and angry. So how do we find a way to embrace people's ideals without alienating others? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think it begins with what I call political cross-training. So when you're training to be a top-tier athlete, it's often a good idea to cross-train with a different method because it'll build and develop you in different ways. So that's where you get these monstrous football players who are taking ballet classes, for instance, because they're wanting to develop their coordination in a different way than football is going to teach them. So in the same way, in politics, we can start to treat different political orientations as a form of cross-training. It's a cross-training for our mind primarily, because we begin to see the world through a different lens and a different set of priorities. So if we're only taking in the viewpoints that we've inherited oftentimes, or that we've developed, but then we're rehearsing that and never even taking as an interesting exploration the worldview of somebody else, we're going to be compromised by that, where our viewpoint is going to become more ossified and more stuck in different ways.
Yeah, so you're doing this cross-training essentially with the political parties. Okay.
Give an example, because our tendency, especially with politics, is to demonize and vilify and often express hatred towards other viewpoints than our own, partially because there's a lot of charge around decision making and what rights we have or don't have, and so there can be a lot of understandable charge with politics. And so what we have to do as a practice, almost as a spiritual practice or a psychological practice, is to unravel our tendency to create more and more of a polarization. I'll give an example in my own life. When Sarah Palin was the vice presidential candidate in 2008, I just really I thought I'd done a lot of work on myself and a lot of personal growth, but I really just could not stand her. It was like nails on a chalkboard. So instead of just rehearsing that, though, after a while I realized that it meant I had some work to do. And so I actually spent the time to read both of her books and see the world through her eyes. You know, you should see the world through growing up in Alaska, the more frontier psychology, hunting for food, the kind of down-home, G-shucks kind of language that at first I found very grating. And after really spending the time to see the world through her eyes with a couple of books, I ended up having a dream where in the dream, she and I were quite friendly with each other, and in fact had a really sweet hug in the dream. So it's kind of a signal to my deeper psyche that it's like, oh, I'd come to terms with who she represented, not just as herself, but as a part of the American population that really has it deserves its own respect, and that needs to be honored. And you know, I ended up writing a column about this at Huffington Post called "Dissolving the Palin Prejudice," and I got a ton of fan mail from conservatives. And what it did is it kind of helped to open the door to a different kind of relationship with conservatives. I still consider myself a progressive, and you know, and I do vote and contribute in alignment with that.